My parents always favored my golden child brother over me, so when they demanded I make him CEO of my business, I silently cut them off. Now they're drowning in debt and begging on their knees for money. I'm 30 years old now, and I finally feel like I can share this experience without getting too emotional about it. I've changed the names for obvious privacy reasons, but everything else happened exactly as I'm telling you. I grew up in a working-class family just outside Jacksonville, Florida. My parents split when I was 9 years old after several years of constant arguing about money and financial stress. My dad was working incredibly long hours running his electrical contracting business, which put a strain on their marriage. Despite all the tension leading up to it, the divorce itself was pretty amicable. There weren't any bitter custody battles or dramatic courtroom scenes that you sometimes hear about. My dad worked as an electrical contractor, running his own small business, while my mom was a registered nurse at the local medical center. The custody arrangement they worked out was pretty standard and functional for everyone involved. I lived with my mom during the weekdays and stayed with my dad every other weekend, plus holidays and summer break. It was the kind of setup that millions of divorced families make work. And honestly, it worked well for us. Dad had rented a decent 2-bedroom apartment about 25 minutes from Mom's place. It wasn't anything fancy or luxurious, but it was clean and comfortable. He had set up the second bedroom specifically for me, with my own bed, dresser, and desk for doing homework. I had posters on the walls and all my favorite books and games there. It felt like a real home away from home. During those early years after the divorce, Dad and I were really tight. We had this great routine that I still remember fondly. Every Saturday morning, we'd work on his old Ford pickup truck together out in the apartment complex parking lot. He taught me practical skills like how to change the oil, replace spark plugs, and handle basic maintenance tasks. He always said that every man should know how to take care of his vehicle properly, and he wanted to make sure I learned these important life skills. We'd spend hours out there in that parking lot, with him patiently explaining how engines worked and why certain parts were crucial for the truck's performance. It wasn't just about the mechanical work. It was quality time where we could talk about anything and everything. Those Saturday morning sessions became some of my most treasured memories from that period of my life. Sundays were reserved for our fishing trips to this small lake about an hour and a half outside of town. Dad knew all the best fishing spots from years of exploring the area. He'd pack us lunch in a cooler, and we'd drive out there early in the morning to claim our favorite spot along the shoreline. We'd sit there for hours, just talking about school, sports, my friends, or whatever was on my mind. Sometimes we'd catch fish, sometimes we wouldn't, but that was never really the point. Those fishing trips represent honestly some of my best childhood memories. Just me and my dad sitting by that peaceful lake, having real conversations about life. He'd ask me about school projects I was working on, help me think through problems I was having with friends, or just listen when I needed to vent about something that was bothering me. It was the kind of father-son bonding that every kid deserves to have. Even during the weekdays when I wasn't staying with him, Dad made sure to stay involved in my daily life. He'd call every couple of days just to check in and see how things were going. How was school today? Do you need any help with your homework? Are you being good for your mom? Nothing earth-shattering or dramatic, but those regular check-ins made me feel like he was still actively engaged in my life, even when I wasn't physically there with him. This whole arrangement worked beautifully for about 4 years. I felt like I had 2 homes where I was loved and supported, and both my parents seemed to be doing well in their separate lives. Dad seemed content with his bachelor lifestyle. His work was going well, and our relationship was stronger than ever. Then everything changed completely when I turned 13 years old. Dad met Linda at some community event. I think it was a charity fundraiser for the local children's medical center where my mom actually worked. Linda was recently divorced herself and had a 10-year-old son named Kevin, who she talked about constantly from the very beginning. Every conversation seemed to circle back to Kevin's accomplishments, Kevin's needs, or Kevin's potential. At first, everything seemed completely normal when Dad started dating her. If anything, he appeared happier and more energetic than I'd seen him in years. He talked about Linda like she was the most amazing woman he'd ever met, praising everything from her sense of humor to her parenting skills. I was genuinely happy to see him excited about someone new in his life. I met them both for the first time at a pizza place downtown. Linda seemed nice enough on the surface. She asked me appropriate questions about school, told me she'd heard so much about me from my dad, and said all the right things that you'd expect from someone trying to make a good first impression. She was clearly making an effort to include me in the conversation and seemed interested in getting to know me better. Kevin struck me as just a regular kid at first. Maybe he was a little quiet, but not in a concerning or rude way. He seemed more interested in the handheld gaming device he'd brought along than in talking to anyone at the table, which was pretty typical behavior for a 10-year-old boy. I didn't think much of it at the time. Kids that age often feel awkward in new social situations with adults. They dated for about 7 months before Dad proposed to her. I remember him being absolutely ecstatic when he told me the news. His whole face lit up as he explained that he'd found someone who made him truly happy again, and that Kevin and I were going to be brothers now. The whole thing moved pretty fast looking back on it, but Dad seemed completely certain about his decision, so I was genuinely happy for him. The wedding was small and intimate, just immediate family and close friends. I was chosen to be the ring bearer, which felt pretty cool for a 13-year-old. Everyone kept commenting on how wonderful it was that Dad was getting a second chance at happiness, and how Kevin and I would make such good brothers. All the adults seemed thrilled about this new blended family that was forming. Looking back now with adult perspective, I think Linda was just incredibly skilled at playing the role of the perfect girlfriend until she got that wedding ring on her finger. She consistently said all the right things, made sure to include me in conversations, and never made me feel like an outsider during their courtship period. She was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in building a relationship with me. But the second they got back from their honeymoon, everything started changing in subtle but unmistakable ways. The first major red flag should have been when they went house hunting immediately after the wedding. Dad had been living in that perfectly decent apartment that worked great for him and accommodated my weekend visits without any problems. I had my own room there with a comfortable bed, a dresser, a desk for doing homework, and I'd put up posters on the walls to make it feel like my space. But suddenly, that arrangement wasn't good enough anymore. Linda insisted they needed a much bigger house in a better neighborhood for the children's sake, as she constantly put it. She kept talking about how Kevin needed more space to grow up properly and develop into a well-rounded young man. She also mentioned how I should have a real bedroom instead of just an apartment room, making it sound like she was advocating for my best interests. So Dad took out this massive mortgage on a 4-bedroom colonial house in one of the newer subdivisions across town. It was way more house than he could realistically afford on an electrical contractor's salary, but Linda convinced him it was a smart investment in the family's future. She painted this picture of how important it was for the boys to have space to grow and for the family to establish themselves in a respectable neighborhood. When it came time to decide on bedroom assignments in the new house, Kevin automatically got the largest bedroom upstairs, complete with his own private bathroom. Meanwhile, I was assigned to the smaller bedroom in the finished basement. Linda explained that it would be much quieter down there for me to focus on my homework. Plus, I'd have more privacy away from the main living areas. What I didn't realize at the time was that this bedroom arrangement was just the very beginning of me being systematically pushed to the margins of Dad's new life. The changes started subtle at first, but the pattern became obvious from the very beginning if you knew what to look for. Dad would still hang out with me when I visited on weekends, which initially made me think that maybe things wouldn't be so different after all. But now Kevin was always included in absolutely everything we did together. This would have been perfectly fine if it was actually about including both of us equally in family activities. But it quickly became clear that it wasn't really about creating inclusive family experiences. Instead, it was entirely about making sure Kevin got the attention and opportunities he wanted, while my needs became secondary considerations. We used to throw a football around in the backyard for hours, just me and Dad. It was one of our regular bonding activities where he'd teach me different throwing techniques, and we'd practice catching passes. Those sessions had always been some of my favorite parts of visiting him. But now suddenly, it became all about teaching Kevin proper throwing technique and catching form. Dad would spend the vast majority of our time correcting Kevin's stance, showing him how to grip the ball properly, and patiently working with him on basic fundamentals. Meanwhile, I would just stand there waiting for someone to throw the ball to me, feeling increasingly like a spectator in what used to be my special time with my father. The focus had completely shifted away from our father-son bonding to Kevin's football education. The same exact thing happened when we worked on the truck together. Dad used to let me hand him tools and would carefully explain what he was doing and why each step was important. It was hands-on learning where I felt genuinely involved in the process. But now Kevin got that job, and I was relegated to watching from the sidelines like some kind of assistant observer. When I'd try to ask questions about what Dad was doing or offer to help out with something, he'd say, "Let Kevin learn this first, then you can have your turn." But somehow, Kevin's learning time never seemed to end, and my turn never actually came around. Kevin would get the hands-on experience while I got pushed further and further away from the activities that used to be our special bonding time. Then came the bigger financial decisions that really opened my eyes to how dramatically the priorities had shifted in this household. Kevin decided he wanted to play travel soccer, which was going to cost about $900 between the league fees, equipment, and travel costs for tournaments. Dad didn't even hesitate for a second before saying yes and writing out the check. There was no discussion about whether the family could afford it or whether it was a wise financial decision. Meanwhile, around the exact same time, I asked if I could join the school debate team. The total cost for the entire year was exactly $35. Suddenly, money was tight, and finances were a major concern. Dad told me that maybe we could look into it next semester when the family's financial situation was better and more stable. Let me repeat that for emphasis. $35 versus $900. But somehow, Kevin's activity was absolutely essential for his development, while mine was completely optional and could be postponed indefinitely. The disparity was so obvious and ridiculous that even my 13-year-old brain could recognize the unfairness of the situation. The worst part was how Linda started inserting herself into every single aspect of my relationship with Dad. If Dad and I were planning to go fishing on Saturday morning, like we'd always done, she'd suddenly suggest that Kevin really wanted to learn how to fish and should come along with us. She'd frame it as a wonderful opportunity for family bonding and for Kevin to learn a new skill. But Kevin would just complain the entire time about being bored, not catching anything, and wanting to go home to play video games instead. So we'd end up cutting our fishing trips short after just an hour instead of spending the whole peaceful morning at the lake like we used to do. Or Dad would get so frustrated with Kevin's constant whining and negative attitude that we just wouldn't go fishing at all, because it wasn't worth dealing with the hassle and drama. Our special father-son traditions were being systematically destroyed, one by one, all in the name of including Kevin in activities he didn't even want to participate in. But somehow it was always my fault if I suggested that maybe Kevin could stay home and do something he actually enjoyed while Dad and I maintained our established routines. That first Christmas together as a blended family was a real eye-opener about how things were going to work in this household going forward. When Christmas morning arrived, Kevin's presents took up about half the space under the tree. He received a brand new bike, an Xbox gaming system, and approximately $700 worth of various other gifts and toys. Meanwhile, I received some clothes and a $25 gift card to a local store. The contrast was so stark and obvious that I couldn't hide my disappointment, despite trying my best to be grateful for what I'd received. I was only 13 years old, and the inequality was just too blatant to ignore or rationalize away. When Linda noticed that I couldn't completely mask my disappointment, she actually had the audacity to lecture me about my attitude. She explained that Kevin needed more gifts because he'd been through a difficult divorce situation and was still adjusting to having a new stepdad in his life. According to her logic, he required extra attention and material support to help him through this challenging transitional period. I wanted to point out that I'd been through the exact same divorce experience and was also adjusting to a completely new family situation with a stepmother and stepbrother. But I could tell from the expressions on both Dad and Linda's faces that bringing up this obvious parallel wouldn't go over well at all. So I just kept my mouth shut and tried to act grateful for my modest pile of gifts. Dad just sat there nodding along with everything Linda said, like her reasoning made perfect sense from a parenting perspective. It was like he'd completely forgotten that I was also a child who'd been through major family upheaval and might benefit from some extra consideration and support during this adjustment period. By the time I started high school, the favoritism had become absolutely impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Kevin was in 8th grade by then, and was already being treated like some kind of prince who could do absolutely no wrong in the eyes of his mother and stepfather. Dad completely rearranged his entire work schedule around Kevin's soccer games and practices, never missing a single one, even if it meant losing money from electrical contracting jobs that he had to turn down or reschedule. Kevin's soccer schedule became the central organizing principle around which all other family activities and commitments had to be arranged. But when I joined the academic decathlon team and we made it all the way to the regional competition, Dad couldn't attend because it conflicted with one of Kevin's regular season soccer games. This wasn't even a playoff game or a championship, just a regular Thursday night game where Kevin would probably spend most of the time riding the bench since he wasn't one of the stronger players on the team. The academic decathlon regionals represented months of hard work and studying on my part, and making it that far was a genuine academic achievement that deserved recognition and family support. But somehow Kevin's routine soccer game, where he might not even get to play, took priority over my actual accomplishment. When the subject of college planning came up during my sophomore year, things got really ugly, and the true extent of the financial inequality became crystal clear. I was pulling mostly A's and B's in all my classes, was a member of the National Honor Society, and had developed clear plans to study civil engineering at the University of Florida. The in-state tuition plus financial aid meant that my college education would cost approximately $13,000 per year, which seemed like a reasonable and manageable amount for a middle-class family to handle. I'd done my research, looked into scholarship opportunities, and had realistic expectations about what my education would cost. But when I brought up college planning discussions with Dad, he got visibly uncomfortable and started talking about how we'd have to carefully evaluate what the family could afford. He suggested that maybe I should seriously consider starting at community college first to save money and then potentially transferring to a 4-year university later if the finances worked out. Meanwhile, Kevin wasn't even in high school yet, and Linda was already opening up a dedicated college savings account specifically for him. She kept talking endlessly about how Kevin had so much potential and deserved the best educational opportunities possible to help him reach his full capabilities. She had already set her heart on him, attending some prestigious private university that would cost $45,000 per year. This was for a kid who was struggling to maintain C's and D's in most of his middle school classes. While I was maintaining a high GPA and had already demonstrated academic success and responsibility, I started working part-time during my junior year of high school, bagging groceries after school and on weekends to start saving money for college expenses. It was exhausting balancing a demanding academic schedule with work responsibilities, but I knew I needed to start building up some savings if I wanted to attend a 4-year university. Dad said he was proud of my work ethic and initiative when I told him about the job. He made some comments about how it was good for young men to learn the value of hard work and understand what it takes to earn money. I felt like maybe this was a sign that he was starting to recognize my efforts and maturity. But when Linda casually suggested that maybe Kevin should get a part-time job too, since he was getting older and could benefit from learning some responsibility, Dad shut that idea down immediately. According to him, Kevin needed to focus entirely on his studies and soccer commitments. His grades might suffer if he had to work, and that could jeopardize his future academic and athletic opportunities. This was the same Kevin who was pulling C's and D's in most of his classes, while I was maintaining a 3.8 GPA despite working 22 hours per week and carrying a full course load. But somehow, protecting Kevin's mediocre grades was more important than recognizing my actual achievements and the discipline I was demonstrating. The absolute breaking point came during my senior year of high school, and it involved my college savings being essentially stolen from me. I had been working diligently and saving every penny I could for 2 solid years, and had managed to put away about $3,200 for college expenses. This represented countless hours of work and a lot of personal sacrifice on my part. One weekend when I came to Dad's house, Linda pulled me aside for what she called a private conversation. She explained that Kevin's travel soccer team had been invited to participate in this special tournament in California over spring break. According to her, it was a huge opportunity for college scouts to see him play, and could really help him secure athletic scholarships down the road. The only problem was that they were short about $2,200 for the trip expenses, including airfare, hotel accommodations, meals, and tournament fees. She asked if I could possibly loan them the money, since I had savings, and they would definitely pay me back by summer. She made it sound like this could really help the whole family financially if Kevin managed to get a soccer scholarship out of the opportunity. I was 18 years old and probably should have just said no immediately, but I didn't want to be the reason Kevin missed out on what could potentially be an important opportunity. Plus, Linda made it sound like this investment could actually benefit everyone if it led to scholarship money that would reduce the family's college expenses. So I went to the bank, withdrew $2,200 from my college savings account, and handed it over to them. It represented most of what I'd managed to save through 2 years of part-time work, but I convinced myself I was doing the right thing for the family. Summer came and went with absolutely no mention of paying me back. When I finally worked up the courage to ask about it in August, just before I was supposed to start college, Linda got immediately defensive and irritated with me. She said they'd had unexpected expenses over the summer months, and that money had gone toward Kevin's various needs and activities. She actually had the nerve to tell me that I should be happy to help out my family instead of keeping track of debts like some kind of loan shark. According to her twisted logic, asking for my own money back made me greedy and selfish, rather than recognizing that they had essentially stolen my college fund. That was my college money they'd basically taken. and somehow I was being portrayed as the bad guy for wanting it returned as promised. Dad stayed completely silent during this entire conversation, wouldn't even look me in the eye, and offered no support or acknowledgement that what they'd done was wrong. I ended up having to attend community college for my first 2 years specifically to save money, since my college fund had been depleted. Then I transferred to the University of Florida to finish my civil engineering degree. I worked full-time at a local warehouse to pay for absolutely everything myself: tuition, textbooks, rent, food, and all other living expenses. Dad would call occasionally during this period, but it was always just surface-level small talk about the weather or general life updates. He never acknowledged the financial hardship I was experiencing or offered any assistance, despite knowing that I was working full-time while attending school full-time. Meanwhile, Kevin was living like absolute royalty during his high school years. Dad paid for him to attend expensive soccer camps every single summer, despite the fact that Kevin wasn't even a standout player on his high school team. When Kevin turned 17, Dad bought him a nearly new Toyota Camry for his birthday, a car that probably cost more than my entire 2 years of community college tuition. Kevin was basically given everything I'd never had access to, while I was grinding away trying to build a future for myself with zero family support. The few times I came home for holidays during my college years, it became painfully obvious that I was just a guest in that house, while Kevin was treated like the undisputed prince of the household. The dynamic was so clear that even casual observers would have been able to pick up on it within minutes of being there. Kevin had transformed into exactly what you'd expect from a kid who had never heard the word no in his entire life. He was arrogant, entitled, lazy, and completely lacking in even the most basic life skills that most teenagers develop naturally. He expected everything to be handed to him and threw tantrums when things didn't go exactly his way. He barely managed to graduate high school with a 2.4 GPA and only got into college because Dad paid for an expensive private tutor to help him bring his grades up just enough to meet minimum admission requirements. But somehow, Kevin was still portrayed as the golden child who could do absolutely no wrong in Dad's eyes. When Kevin's college acceptance letter finally arrived in the mail, Dad actually called me specifically to share what he considered to be fantastic news. He was acting like Kevin getting into a mediocre state school with barely passing grades was some kind of major achievement that deserved family-wide celebration and recognition. I reminded him that I had graduated summa cum laude from the University of Florida's engineering program just 3 months earlier, which represented years of hard work and academic excellence. Dad had barely acknowledged that accomplishment, certainly hadn't called any relatives to brag about it, and had acted like it was just something that was expected rather than celebrated. The contrast in how our respective achievements were treated couldn't have been more obvious if they'd tried to make it that way intentionally. I graduated with my engineering degree and managed to land a decent job at a manufacturing plant about 2 hours away from Jacksonville. It wasn't the most glamorous position in the world, but it offered a solid starting salary with good benefits and opportunities for advancement. Most importantly, it gave me the financial independence I'd been working toward for years. Dad did come to my graduation ceremony, which was appreciated, but he spent most of the day talking to relatives and family friends about Kevin's upcoming freshman year of college. Even at my own graduation, the conversation somehow managed to center around Kevin's future plans and potential rather than acknowledging what I'd actually accomplished. Moving away for work turned out to be honestly the best decision I ever made. It finally gave me some real physical and emotional distance from all the family drama and dysfunction. For the first time in years, I was able to start building my own life, surrounded by people who actually valued what I brought to the table instead of treating me like some kind of afterthought or secondary family member. About a year after graduation, I met Carla through mutual friends at a backyard barbecue. She's an elementary school teacher who originally came to Florida from Georgia for a teaching position. She's down to earth, genuinely funny, incredibly smart, and most importantly, she actually listened when I talked instead of just waiting for her turn to speak. We hit it off immediately and started dating seriously within a few months. Carla was the first person I'd ever really opened up to about my family situation and all the dysfunction I'd experienced growing up. At first, she thought I was probably exaggerating the extent of the favoritism or being overly sensitive about normal blended family growing pains that lots of kids experience. But then she met them at a family barbecue that summer, and everything became crystal clear to her. Dad spent the entire afternoon talking to anyone who would listen about Kevin's college soccer career, even though Kevin was riding the bench and barely got any playing time during actual games. Meanwhile, my engineering job and recent promotion got maybe 3 minutes of total conversation throughout the entire day. Linda made these passive-aggressive comments to Carla about how teaching elementary school must be nice, but probably doesn't pay very well. She suggested that maybe Carla should consider going back to school for something more practical and financially stable. It was a really subtle way of implying that Carla wasn't good enough or successful enough to be part of their family. Kevin was there too, home for summer break after his freshman year of college. He spent the whole time bragging about his fraternity and all the parties they threw on campus. He kept talking about how he was going to be a sports agent someday, or maybe get into sports marketing, because he understood athletics so well from his playing experience. When Carla asked him what his actual major was, he literally said he hadn't decided yet, because he was keeping his options open and didn't want to limit himself too early. This was a kid going into his sophomore year of college who still had no idea what he wanted to study or what career path he was interested in pursuing. After that barbecue, Carla completely understood why I didn't visit very often or maintain close relationships with Dad's side of the family. She said it was painfully obvious to any objective observer that Dad had emotionally checked out of being my father years ago and was just going through the basic motions to avoid feeling guilty about his choices. Carla and I got engaged after dating for 2 years and started planning a small, intimate wedding ceremony. When it came time to discuss the guest list, we had some really tough conversations about whether to invite Dad's side of the family at all. The relationship had become so strained and one-sided that I wasn't sure I even wanted them there on what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. In the end, I decided to keep the wedding small and only invite people who had actually been supportive of our relationship and genuinely cared about our happiness. This meant a much shorter guest list than some people might have expected, but it felt like the right decision for us. Dad and Linda did come to the wedding, but Kevin didn't even bother showing up because he had some fraternity parties scheduled for the same weekend. Apparently, a college party with his buddies was more important than supporting his supposed big brother on his wedding day. It was a real nice way to demonstrate family loyalty and commitment. Dad and Linda spent most of the reception talking to other guests about Kevin's post-graduation plans and career aspirations. They barely talked to Carla or me, except during the formal family photos that the photographer arranged. Even at my own wedding, somehow the conversation kept circling back to Kevin's future potential rather than celebrating what Carla and I had built together. My career started really taking off around this time, which provided a nice contrast to the family dysfunction. I got promoted to senior engineer and then project manager within 3 years of starting at the manufacturing plant. I was making good money by age 27 and had been able to buy a nice 3-bedroom house in a good neighborhood. Life was genuinely good, and I was building the kind of stable, successful future I'd always worked toward. Meanwhile, serious cracks were starting to show in Dad's perfect second family fantasy. Kevin graduated college with some completely useless communications degree and immediately moved back home because he couldn't find a job that met his inflated expectations and sense of entitlement. Dad was still financially supporting him, while Kevin bounced between various part-time retail jobs and get-rich-quick schemes that never amounted to anything substantial. Kevin would work at a cell phone store for a few months, then quit because the manager was stupid or the hours weren't convenient for his social life. The mortgage on that big house Dad had bought was becoming a serious financial problem too. Electrical contracting work had gotten less steady over the years, and Dad was in his late 50s now with his body starting to wear down from decades of physically demanding labor. Linda had never held down a steady full-time job during their entire marriage. She worked occasional part-time retail positions when money got especially tight, but she'd never taken on the kind of consistent employment that could really help with their mounting expenses. Kevin wasn't contributing anything financially to the household, despite living there rent-free and eating their food. When Dad tentatively suggested that maybe Kevin should pay some minimal amount for room and board, Linda shut that idea down immediately. According to her, Kevin was going through a difficult transition period and needed family support rather than additional stress and financial pressure. 3 years ago, the manufacturing plant where I worked got bought out by a massive international corporation. They offered generous buyout packages to senior staff or transfers to other facilities in different states across the country. Most people took the buyouts because relocating across the country wasn't realistic for their family situations or career goals. I saw this as a huge opportunity rather than a setback. I used my buyout money plus everything Carla and I had managed to save over the years to start my own engineering consulting business. Manufacturing plants everywhere need experienced engineers who understand their processes and can solve complex technical problems efficiently. I had 12 years of hands-on experience in the industry, plus all the right professional connections and client relationships. It was absolutely terrifying at first, going from the security of a steady paycheck to being completely responsible for generating my own income and building a client base from scratch. But Carla supported my decision completely, and we tightened our budget significantly for the first year, while I focused on building up the business and establishing a reputation in the consulting world. The business worked out better than I had ever imagined possible. By the end of the first year, I was already making more money than I'd ever earned as a salaried employee. By year 2, I had to hire my first subcontractor to help handle the workload. By year 3, I had a small team of experienced engineers working for me, and we'd rented actual office space to accommodate our growing operations. The business grew faster than I'd ever expected, primarily because word of mouth in the manufacturing industry is absolutely everything. Once you prove that you can solve problems efficiently and save companies significant amounts of money, they tell their colleagues at other manufacturing facilities about your services. I started getting contracts from facilities 4 states away, sometimes flying out for week-long projects to assess their operations and implement solutions. The consulting work was challenging and rewarding, and I was finally building the kind of professional reputation and financial security I'd always dreamed of having. Meanwhile, Dad's financial situation was deteriorating every single month. Electrical contracting work had slowed way down due to broader economic issues in our area, and the competition for available jobs had gotten much more intense. He was getting fewer contracts overall, and the ones he did manage to secure were paying significantly less than they used to. His chronic back problems were also getting progressively worse, making it much harder for him to handle the physical demands that electrical work requires. Some days he couldn't work at all because of severe pain and muscle spasms that left him essentially bedridden. The combination of fewer available jobs and declining physical capabilities was creating a perfect storm of financial stress. Kevin had briefly moved out after college graduation, but came crawling back home within 7 months when he couldn't afford to pay rent on his part-time retail salary. He'd managed to find a small apartment with a roommate, but couldn't handle the financial responsibility of independent living when it conflicted with his social life and entertainment expenses. Linda started working full-time for the first time in their entire marriage, but retail management positions only pay around $32,000 per year. It wasn't nearly enough to offset Dad's declining income or make a meaningful dent in their accumulated debt and monthly expenses. They were steadily falling behind on mortgage payments, car payments, and credit card bills. The financial pressure was mounting every month, and they had no realistic plan for getting back on track or reducing their expenses to match their actual income. 2 months ago, on a Wednesday evening, my phone rang with Dad's number displayed on the screen. We hadn't talked in probably 9 months, not since some awkward small talk during Christmas dinner, where we'd both avoided discussing anything meaningful or personal. "Hey son, how are things going with you and Carla?" he asked when I answered. His voice sounded older than I remembered, more tired and stressed than I'd heard him in years. There was a weariness in his tone that immediately made me think something serious was happening. We made uncomfortable small talk for several minutes about work, the weather, and other safe topics before he finally got to the real reason for calling. I could tell there was definitely something more substantial he wanted to discuss, but he was having trouble working up to it. "I heard through your mom that your consulting business is doing really well these days," he said eventually. "That's fantastic news, and I'm really proud of what you've accomplished with your career." I thanked him for the acknowledgement, but could tell there was definitely more coming. Dad had never called just to congratulate me on professional success before, so I knew this conversation was leading somewhere specific. "Listen, I was wondering if maybe you might have some work available for Kevin," he said, finally getting to the point. "He's been having a really tough time finding something that fits his skill set and properly utilizes his college education. I thought maybe you could give him an opportunity to learn the business and get some real-world experience." I almost started laughing out loud at the suggestion. Kevin's skill set? What skills exactly was he referring to? I asked Dad what kind of relevant work experience Kevin had that would apply to engineering consulting for manufacturing facilities. "Well, he's got his college degree and he's worked several retail management positions over the past few years," Dad replied. "He's a smart kid who learns quickly when he's motivated. He just needs someone to give him a real chance to prove himself in a professional environment." I patiently explained that my business was highly technical engineering consulting for manufacturing facilities. I needed people with engineering degrees, industry certifications, and years of hands-on experience working with complex industrial systems. Kevin had absolutely none of those qualifications or any related background. "But you could train him on the job, right?" Dad persisted. He's family, and I know he'd work hard if you gave him the opportunity to show what he can do. There it was. After 16 years of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own father's house, now Kevin needed a job, and suddenly I was considered important family again. The irony was absolutely incredible. I told Dad I'd think about his request and get back to him, though honestly I'd already made up my mind about the situation. The audacity of asking me to hire someone with zero qualifications just because he happened to be family was pretty incredible, especially given our history. Exactly 1 week later, Linda called me directly. This was highly unusual since she'd never initiated a phone conversation with me in all the years I'd known her. Usually, any communication went through Dad, so her calling me personally immediately put me on alert that something significant was happening. "I hope you don't mind me calling you directly," she began. "But I wanted to talk to you personally about Kevin's employment situation and see if we could work something out that would benefit everyone involved." She launched into this elaborate, rehearsed-sounding speech about how Kevin was just going through a rough transitional period and needed guidance from a successful role model like me. She talked about how much it would mean to Dad if I could help his son get established in a real career with actual growth potential. I pointed out that Kevin wasn't actually Dad's biological son. He was her son from her previous marriage. And considering how I'd been systematically treated as a secondary family member for 16 years while Kevin got priority treatment in absolutely everything, it was pretty ironic that now they wanted my help when it suited their needs. Linda got immediately defensive at this observation. "That's not fair at all," she said, her voice rising slightly. "We always treated you like a full member of this family. Kevin has always considered you his big brother, and we've always tried to include you in everything we did." I reminded her about the $2,200 she'd borrowed from my college savings account and never paid back as promised. I brought up how Kevin got the master bedroom while I was stuck in the basement. I mentioned the car Dad bought for Kevin while I worked part-time jobs just to afford community college tuition. "Those were completely different circumstances," she replied dismissively. "Kevin had different needs at the time, and we did what we thought was best for both of you boys, given the situations you were each dealing with." I told her I wasn't interested in hiring Kevin for a position he wasn't remotely qualified for, and ended the call before she could continue her guilt trip routine. Sure enough, Kevin himself called me exactly 4 days later. This was literally the first time we'd had a direct conversation in over 2 years, which should tell you something about how close this supposed family relationship actually was. "Dude, what's your deal?" he said immediately, without even bothering with basic pleasantries. "Mom said you basically told her to forget about giving me a job opportunity. That's pretty messed up, don't you think?" I calmly explained once again that I run a specialized engineering consulting firm, and he doesn't have any relevant education, experience, or qualifications that would enable him to do the kind of work we handle for our clients. "Come on, man, it can't be that complicated," he replied with incredible arrogance. "You just go look at machines and tell people how to fix them, right? I could totally learn that stuff. I'm not stupid or anything." The arrogance was absolutely unbelievable. He thought that 12 years of engineering education and professional experience was something any random person could just pick up in a few weeks of on-the-job training. He had no concept of the technical knowledge, problem-solving skills, and industry expertise required to do this work effectively. I suggested that if he was genuinely interested in engineering, he could go back to school and get the proper education and certifications that would actually qualify him for this type of work. "Why should I have to waste years going back to school when you could just teach me what I need to know on the job?" he responded. "We're supposed to be family, aren't we? Family helps each other out when someone needs a break." There was that magic word again. Family. Where exactly was all this family loyalty when I was working part-time to pay for textbooks while Kevin was getting his college tuition handed to him? Where was the family support when I was eating ramen noodles in my dorm room while Kevin was getting taken out to expensive restaurants? Kevin then made a comment that really pushed me over the edge and revealed exactly how he viewed our entire relationship. He said, "Maybe you're just jealous because you were always Dad's favorite growing up, and this is your petty way of getting revenge now that the tables have turned." I told him he was absolutely right about one thing. Dad definitely had a clear favorite over the years, and it certainly wasn't me. But being the favorite son hadn't exactly worked out well for him, had it? Here he was at 26 years old, still living with his parents, working part-time retail jobs, and begging his stepbrother for career assistance. He got angry and started yelling about how I'd turned into a bitter, resentful person who didn't care about family loyalty or helping people when they needed support. Then he hung up on me without saying goodbye, which was pretty typical of his maturity level. About 7 weeks ago, My mom called with some concerning news about Dad's financial situation. She'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Dad and Linda were in serious financial trouble and facing foreclosure on their house. This wasn't just rumors or speculation. Apparently, the situation had progressed to official legal proceedings. According to what Mom had learned, they'd missed several mortgage payments over the past year, and the bank had officially started foreclosure proceedings against them. They had exactly 60 days to either pay everything they owed plus penalties and fees, or vacate the property completely. Kevin had been absolutely no help whatsoever with this financial crisis, despite being a grown man living in the house rent-free. He was still bouncing between part-time retail jobs, still talking about his big plans and future opportunities that never materialized into actual income or financial contribution to the household. Linda was now working 2 different retail positions just to try to make ends meet. But it wasn't nearly enough to cover their monthly expenses, let alone catch up on the back payments they owed. The stress was clearly taking a toll on everyone in the household. Dad was taking whatever electrical contracting work he could find. But his chronic back problems were getting progressively worse with age. He couldn't handle the physical demands of the job like he used to. And some days, he couldn't work at all because of severe pain and muscle spasms that left him essentially immobilized. Mom said that Dad was too proud to directly ask family members for financial help. But Linda had been making phone calls to various relatives to see if anyone could loan them money to avoid losing the house. Apparently, they needed about $16,500 to get current on their payments and avoid foreclosure. Here's the thing that really got to me about this entire situation. I could easily write that check without it affecting my lifestyle at all. My consulting business had been incredibly successful, and I had significantly more money in savings than they probably realized. The amount they needed wouldn't even make a meaningful dent in my financial security. But why should I bail them out of problems they'd created through years of poor financial decisions and living beyond their means? Why should I rescue people who had treated me like a second-class citizen for 16 years while prioritizing Kevin's every want and desire? Last week, Dad called again, and this time he sounded completely defeated. His voice was shaky and weak, and he seemed like he'd aged 10 years since our last conversation. The stress and desperation were obvious even over the phone. "Son, I need to ask you something, and it's not easy for me to have this conversation," he began, clearly struggling with having to ask for help. He explained the entire foreclosure situation in detail, though I already knew most of it from my conversation with Mom. He asked if there was any possible way I could help them out with a loan to save the house and keep the family from losing their home. "I know we haven't always been as close as we probably should have been over the years, but you're my son, and I'm really hoping you'll help family during this difficult time," he said, his voice breaking slightly. I asked him point blank where Kevin was in all this financial planning. Wasn't Kevin also family? Shouldn't a 26-year-old man be contributing something meaningful to help save his childhood home? "Kevin's doing what he can, but he doesn't have the kind of resources or income that you do," Dad replied. "He's still trying to get his career established and find his place in the world." I actually laughed out loud at that response. Kevin was doing what he could? What exactly was he doing besides living rent-free and working 22 hours per week at a cell phone store? What career was he trying to establish exactly? Dad got quiet for a long moment before continuing. "I know you're probably angry about some things that happened when you were younger. Maybe I made some mistakes back then in how I handled the family situation. Some mistakes." I told him it wasn't just some mistakes. It was 16 straight years of being treated like an outsider in my own father's house, while Kevin got handed everything he ever wanted without having to work for any of it. "Look, I may not have handled everything perfectly, but that doesn't mean you should just stand by and let us lose our home," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. I told Dad I needed time to think about everything and would call him back soon. But honestly, I'd already made up my mind about the situation. The audacity of expecting me to fix their problems after years of being treated poorly was just too much to overlook. 2 days after Dad's desperate phone call, Linda phoned me directly in what can only be described as full panic mode. She was crying before she even finished saying hello, and I could hear the desperation and fear in her voice immediately. "Please, you absolutely have to help us," she said through her tears. "I know we haven't always seen eye to eye about everything over the years, but we're all family here. Kevin considers you his big brother, and this foreclosure is going to absolutely devastate him." I corrected her right away. Kevin was her biological son and Dad's stepson. He'd never been my brother in any meaningful sense of the word, despite what she wanted to believe about our relationship. "Don't be like that," she replied, her voice becoming more emotional. "We raised you as part of this family for years. You lived in our house, ate our food, and we supported you through high school and college." I nearly choked on that statement. They raised me? I had raised myself while living primarily with my mother and working part-time jobs to pay for my own expenses. They had provided a basement bedroom every other weekend and occasional meals. That was hardly the same thing as raising a child or providing meaningful support. Linda started sobbing even harder and saying they had no idea what they were going to do or where they'd live if they lost the house. How could they possibly start over at their ages? What would happen to Kevin if he had to move back in with relatives or find his own place? I calmly suggested several practical solutions that any reasonable adult would consider. They could downsize to a more affordable apartment that matched their actual income. Kevin could get a full-time job and start contributing to household expenses like any other adult living in the home. They could make some mature financial decisions instead of continuing to live beyond their means like they had for the past decade. She got angry then and started yelling at me through her tears. She called me selfish and heartless for turning my back on family when they needed help the most. She said Kevin was dealing with depression and anxiety about his future, and I was basically kicking him while he was down during a vulnerable time. I pointed out that Kevin had been struggling with basic adult responsibilities his entire life because nobody had ever made him face real consequences for his choices or lack of effort. Maybe losing the house would provide exactly the reality check he needed to finally grow up and become a functional adult. She hung up on me after screaming that I'd regret not helping family when they really needed me most. Yesterday afternoon, Kevin showed up unannounced at my office building. He just walked right past my office manager like he owned the place and barged into my private office without any appointment or permission. "We need to have a serious conversation right now," he announced, settling into the chair across from my desk without being invited to sit down. I told him to sit down and make it quick, because I had an important client conference call scheduled in 30 minutes and couldn't afford to be late or unprepared for it. He launched into this whole prepared speech about how I was being petty and vindictive over ancient history. He claimed that Dad had always done his absolute best as a father, and I was holding grudges over trivial stuff that happened years ago when we were just kids. Trivial stuff? I asked him if he meant trivial things like getting a car bought for him while I worked part-time to afford community college tuition, like getting his college education fully paid for while I took out student loans, like getting the master bedroom while I lived in the basement. Kevin got defensive and said none of that was his fault because he was just a child at the time. He didn't ask Dad to treat him differently or give him special advantages over me. It wasn't his responsibility to manage the family dynamics or ensure everything was fair. I asked him what he'd done as an adult to acknowledge the inequality or try to make things right. Had he ever suggested that maybe Dad should treat both sons fairly? Had he ever tried to build a genuine relationship with me based on mutual respect rather than just expecting benefits when he needed them? He couldn't come up with answers to any of those questions because he'd never even thought about the situation from my perspective. It had never occurred to him to consider how his privileged treatment might have affected me. Then, he played what he thought was his winning card. "Look, I know you probably hate me for whatever reason, but don't take it out on Dad and Mom. They don't deserve to lose their house because of problems between you and me." I told him he was right about one thing. This situation wasn't really about Dad and Linda anymore. This was about him finally being forced to confront reality after 26 years of being shielded from consequences. "You've spent your entire life getting things handed to you that you never earned," I continued. "College tuition paid, car purchased, room and board provided well into your 20s. And what exactly do you have to show for all those advantages? You're 26 with no marketable skills, no work ethic, and no independence. Maybe losing the house will force you to actually become a functional adult." Kevin got furious and started yelling about how I'd turned into a cold, calculating person who didn't care about family bonds or loyalty. He accused me of being jealous and bitter about the past instead of moving forward like a mature adult. I told him I cared about real family relationships plenty. I had a wife who supported my dreams, a mother who'd always been there for me, and in-laws who treated me with genuine respect and kindness. That was my actual family. As for him, his mother, and their longtime enabler, they could figure out their own financial problems like other adults do. I was done being a backup plan for people who'd never made me a priority in their lives. He stormed out of my office after saying I'd be sorry when Dad ended up getting seriously hurt because of my selfishness and greed. This morning, I received a text message from an unknown number. When I opened it, the message was from Linda using someone else's phone to contact me. "Sheriff's Department came to house today with official eviction papers. We have exactly 2 weeks to pack everything and get out. I really hope you're satisfied with yourself now." I showed the text to Carla over breakfast, and she asked if I felt guilty about not bailing them out financially. She said she'd support whatever decision I made, but wanted to know how I was processing everything emotionally and whether I had any regrets about my choice. Honestly, I don't feel bad about it at all. These people made deliberate choices for 16 straight years that led them to this point. They chose to prioritize Kevin's wants over my basic needs. They chose to live significantly beyond their financial means instead of making responsible decisions. They chose to enable a grown man who refuses to take responsibility for his own life and future. Now they're facing the natural consequences of those choices. And suddenly I'm supposed to swoop in and save the day with money I earned through years of hard work and sacrifice that they never acknowledged or appreciated. I built my success despite their lack of support, not because of it. Every single achievement in my life happened while they were focused exclusively on propping up their golden child, who has turned out to be completely worthless as an adult. And now that their golden child has failed to launch after all their investment, they want me to fix the mess they created through years of poor parenting and financial irresponsibility. Carla says she's genuinely proud of me for setting healthy boundaries and refusing to let them guilt me into solving problems they brought on themselves. My real family, her, my mom, my in-laws, and close friends, they all completely support my decision to stay out of this situation and let them face the consequences of their actions. As for Dad, Linda, and Kevin, they'll figure something out because people always do when they don't have enablers to fall back on anymore. Maybe Kevin will finally get a real full-time job and start acting like the adult he should have become years ago. Maybe they'll learn to live within their actual means instead of pretending they're wealthier than they are. Maybe Dad will realize that treating your children fairly matters more than keeping your second wife happy. Maybe he'll understand that you can't just ignore one child for 16 years and then expect them to rescue you when your favorite child turns out to be a disappointment. Or maybe they won't learn anything meaningful from this experience and will just keep making the same destructive patterns in whatever smaller place they end up living. Maybe they'll continue to blame me for their problems instead of taking responsibility for the choices that led them here. Either way, that's not my problem to solve anymore. I spent too many years trying to earn recognition and love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth their time or effort. I'm not going to spend my adult life fixing the consequences of their poor decisions when they never supported me through my struggles. I have a successful business, a loving wife, and genuine relationships with people who actually value what I bring to their lives. I've built something meaningful despite their neglect, and I'm not going to let their crisis derail the life I've worked so hard to create. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of their actions instead of enabling their dysfunction. Maybe this will be the wake-up call they need, or maybe it won't. But either way, I'm done being their backup plan after years of being treated like their backup son. What do you think? Did I make the right choice, or am I being too harsh given that it's still family we're talking about?